Hello, my name is Kitty. I thought refusing to pay for my sister's extravagant wedding was simply drawing a boundary, but that single word no turned my own family against me. My father kicked me out of dinner, my stepmother whispered poison in his ear, and my sister wore the necklace my late mother promised to me. They erased my name, cut me out of the will, and told the world I wasn't a daughter anymore. But in the silence they forced on me, I found a strength they never expected. What would you have done? I've always thought of myself as the extra piece in a family puzzle that never quite fit. Being the youngest daughter was supposed to mean I was cherished, shielded, maybe even spoiled a little. But in our house, it felt more like being an afterthought. By the time I came along, my father's patience was thin, my stepmother's tolerance thinner, and my older siblings had already claimed the spotlight. I built my life in Austin, teaching high school English, living quietly in a one-bedroom apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and chalk dust. Independence became my comfort. When people in this country talk about weddings, they use words like joy, family, love. But I've seen enough to know that more often than not, it's money that fuels the whole engine. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, "Money often costs too much." The line stays with me because I've watched families tear themselves apart over who paid for what. That truth came knocking at my own door one gray March morning. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, with gold-embossed letters spelling out my sister Ignatia's name and her fiancé's beneath it. I traced my finger over the raised lettering before I even opened it. Weddings always carry that sense of ceremony, even in the paper. I slid the invitation out, bracing myself for the glitter of extravagant promises. But what caught my eye wasn't the date, the venue, or the endless cursive script. It was how my name was written. Guest of Bronwyn. My older brother's name in bold, mine as though I were his +1. I read it 3 times, my eyes blurring with a mix of disbelief and the sting of humiliation. My own family had reduced me to a footnote. I picked up my phone and called Bronwyn, the dial tone stretching the silence before his voice finally came through, warm but weary. "Hey, Kitty," he said. "What's going on?" "I just got the invitation," I told him. "Did you see it?" "They put me down as your guest." There was a pause, long enough for me to hear him exhale. "Maybe it was just a mistake," he said carefully, his voice carrying that practiced neutrality he often used when stuck between me and the rest of them. "A mistake?" I repeated, bitterness cutting into my words. "Or was it a message?" He didn't answer right away. "Don't take it personally. You know how Dad and Mahola handle things." "Not personally. Bronwyn, they wrote me out. It's not a typo. It's a reminder of where I stand." Bronwyn sighed. "Look, I'll talk to them. Don't let it ruin your day." I wanted to argue, to demand why he never pressed harder on my behalf, but I swallowed it. Arguing with Bronwyn never changed the outcome. He was always the quiet ally who never stepped fully into the light. When we hung up, I sat holding the invitation, its glossy weight pressing down on me, like proof of how invisible I had become. A week later, I drove out to my father's ranch-style home on the edge of town for a family dinner. The sun dipped low as I pulled into the driveway, the house glowing in the amber light. From the outside, it looked like any proud Texas home: red brick, a wide porch, wind chimes swaying with the evening breeze. Inside, though, it felt like walking into a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. The long dining table was set with polished silverware and wine glasses that caught the light. Ignacia sat in the center, her fiancé at her side, their voices lilting as they bragged about the wedding venue, the imported linens, the champagne they'd chosen. Mahola watched me with that sharp, assessing gaze, the kind that measured people not by who they were, but by what they provided. I took my seat, forcing a smile, trying to ignore the chill in the air. My father, Obdulia, cleared his throat, drawing all attention to him. His hands rested on a glossy folder he'd brought to the table. "I'll get right to it," he said. "We've laid out the expenses for the wedding. Everyone's contributing. Kitty, we expect you to do your part. Family pulls together. He slid the folder toward me. I stared at it, blinking. My fingers hovered before I opened it, revealing a list so extravagant it read more like a corporate budget than a wedding plan. $60,000 venue, imported flowers from Europe, a cake priced at $3,000, a honeymoon that looked more like an international tour. Family pulls together? I thought bitterly. Or family pulls apart the one who doesn't comply? The room waited for my reaction. Ignatia's smile widened as if daring me to resist. I tried to keep my voice steady. Dad, I'm a teacher. I don't have this kind of money lying around. His eyes narrowed. Don't start with excuses. You've been living on your own long enough. It's time you gave back. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. The others sat quietly, letting his words hang in the air like a judgment already passed. Ignacia tapped her manicured nails on the table. Her fiancé leaned back with a smirk, and Mahola's lips curled into a faint smile of satisfaction. I looked again at the bill, doing the math in my head. Even if I emptied my savings account, I couldn't come close to the number they expected. It was more than a financial burden. It was an insult, a demand that erased the reality of my life and painted me as ungrateful. Guilt is a rope that wears thin, Ayn Rand once wrote. And in that moment, I felt the rope tugging at me, fraying with every accusation. The rest of dinner blurred, small talk laced with passive jabs, stories told as though I wasn't in the room. I kept my answers short, pushing food around my plate, the weight of the folder still heavy in my lap. When I finally rose from the table, the knot in my stomach was tight, my chest heavy with words I hadn't spoken. Walking toward the door, I knew this wasn't about love or family or a celebration of unity. This was a transaction, and I had just been handed the bill. The silence that followed my father's words weighed more heavily than anything else in that dining room. The glossy folder of expenses sat closed in front of me, but the expectation hung in the air like smoke, filling every space. Nobody moved their forks, nobody spoke. It was as if everyone was waiting for me to either cave in or explode. My father's face was set like stone, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on me in that way that said he was done listening before I'd even started speaking. Ignacia leaned back in her chair with that smug little smile that only grew sharper when she knew she had Dad's full backing. Mahola, my stepmother, didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. Her lips curled at the corners, the look of someone who had set the trap and was just watching it snap shut. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes darting between the three of them, and thought, sometimes silence isn't peace. It's a loaded gun waiting for someone to pull the trigger. And I knew in my bones that what was coming next would be worse than the bill itself. The conversation didn't take long to resume. Ignacia was the first to break the quiet, her voice syrupy but edged with steel. Every one of us is contributing, she said, lifting her glass as though making a toast. Why should you be different? Mahola chimed in without missing a beat. We all sacrifice for family. If you can't, maybe you don't understand what family means. I turned toward Bronwyn, hoping for some sign that he would speak up. But he kept his gaze fixed on his plate, shoulders slightly hunched, his fork moving in slow circles. He was the silent ally who wanted to help but never dared. I straightened in my chair, forcing myself to speak evenly. I'm not refusing to help. I'm telling you what I can and can't do. I live on a teacher's salary. The numbers you're asking for aren't possible. Ignacia tilted her head, her eyes sparkling with mock pity. We all make sacrifices. Maybe if you managed your life differently, you'd have something to give. That's not fair, I replied, my tone sharper now. I've managed on my own for years without asking this family for anything. That's sacrifice, too. Mahola shook her head slowly, like a teacher disappointed in a student. No, Kitty. Sacrifice is putting others before yourself, not just surviving on your own. Their words pressed down harder than the numbers in that folder. Every justification I gave was twisted into an excuse. Every truth I spoke was reframed as selfishness. Inside, anger burned hot. But I thought of a line I had once underlined in a worn paperback. Family is supposed to be our safe haven. Very often, it's the place we find the deepest heartache. Ianla Van Zant was right. That night, my family had turned from haven into courtroom, and I was the one on trial. Just when I thought they'd had their fill, my father's deep voice cut through the chatter. He leaned back, clearing his throat like a judge about to read the verdict. "Look at your sister," he said, loud enough for everyone, even the neighbors who had been invited for dessert, to hear. "She's responsible, she's giving, she's everything a daughter should be." He raised his glass toward Ignacia, whose cheeks glowed with the praise. Then he turned those sharp eyes on me. "Why can't you be more like her?" The room froze. Forks stopped clinking against plates. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. All eyes turned to me, some filled with pity, some with curiosity, others with quiet agreement. I felt the humiliation rush up my throat, but I didn't let it choke me. Not this time. I took a breath, measured, steady, and said quietly, "I am not my sister, and I will never be anyone's blank check." The words didn't thunder across the room, but they landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ripples of discomfort spread in silence. My father blinked, surprised that I'd spoken back at all. Ignacia's lips pressed into a thin line. Mahola's eyes narrowed, already calculating how to twist my words later, but for once, I didn't lower my eyes. I looked each of them in the face, letting the silence settle. Inside, my thoughts churned. This wasn't new. My father had been elevating Ignacia for as long as I could remember, holding her up like the golden standard, while brushing me aside like the spare part. Tonight was only the latest chapter in a pattern that had been etched deep into our family history. In America, people love to talk about fairness, about equality, about every child having the same chance. But favoritism in families cuts deeper than any workplace bias. You can quit a job. You can't quit your blood. I pushed back my chair slowly, not rushing, not flinching. I could feel my sister's eyes boring into me, my father's jaw clenching tighter, Mahola's stare following me like a hawk. "They think I'll bend," I told myself as I rose, "but the more they push, the straighter I'll stand." And I knew then, with a clarity that surprised even me, that this fight was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke with the heaviness of the night still pressing on my chest. The words from the table replayed themselves in a loop, my father's voice booming, Ignacia's smug smile, Mahola's satisfied stare. Even the silence of Bronwyn lingered like an echo. I rolled onto my side in the quiet of my small apartment, the sunlight slipping through half-closed blinds. My place wasn't much. Second-hand furniture, shelves lined with worn books, a couple of framed prints I'd picked up at flea markets. But it was mine. The modestness gave me comfort. It was a world I had built on my own terms, away from their scrutiny. Still, independence doesn't insulate you from hurt. As I brewed my morning coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that the dinner had given me more than just a bill. It had given me a reminder, clearer than ever, that I had always been the outsider in my own family. That realization stung in a way no number on a page could. I leaned against the counter, sipping slowly, and thought of an old proverb I once read. The axe forgets, but the tree remembers. The people who cut you may move on, but the scar they leave never fades. That was how I felt that morning, scarred by years of small cuts they probably didn't even remember. My mind drifted back to a family gathering years ago. I must have been 12, maybe 13. The house had been full of relatives. Laughter rose from every corner. The air smelled of roast turkey and spiced cider. My father had been holding court at the head of the table, telling stories about his children, pride ringing in his voice. "My oldest boy, Bronwyn," he said, clapping his son on the shoulder. "He's my rock, steady, dependable, the kind of son any man would be proud of." The table applauded. My brother's face turned red with embarrassment, but he smiled too. "And Ignacia," my father continued, his eyes glowing, "she's the jewel of this family. Beautiful, responsible, always looking out for everyone, a true daughter." Ignacia beamed, soaking up the praise like sunlight. I remember leaning forward, waiting, expecting my name to follow. It never came. Finally, I blurted out with the innocence of a child desperate to belong. And me, Dad? He looked at me, barely pausing before chuckling. You're still young. You'll find your way. Then he turned back to the adults, the conversation flowing on without me. Even as a child, I felt the sting. Everyone else had a role, a title, a place. I was left undefined, like a draft that never made it into the final script. Now, standing in my kitchen years later, I realized that the wedding invitation listing me as guest of Bronwyn hadn't been a mistake at all. It was part of a pattern. I had been erased long before the gold-lettered card arrived in my mailbox. I set my mug down and closed my eyes, and my mind replayed the silence from Bronwyn at dinner. His fists clenched slightly, his fork idle on the plate, his gaze lowered. He had wanted to speak, I could feel it, but the words never came. Ignatia had been boasting again. Every family has to sacrifice, she had declared, her voice slicing through the air. I remember Bronwyn shifting in his seat, his voice catching in his throat. Kitty, he started, but then he stopped, letting the moment collapse. His silence was louder than Ignatia's words. Silence can wound more than insults, because it tells you no one will step in when you're cornered. In that silence, I realized I was on my own. I don't hate Bronwyn for it. Not exactly. His silence wasn't betrayal so much as fear. He has always been the one to keep peace, even if it meant letting injustice sit unchallenged. But understanding doesn't soften the hurt. Many people my age, especially those older who've lived through long family battles, know this truth. Siblings often choose neutrality over justice. And that neutrality is its own kind of cruelty. I carried my coffee to the window, watching as the Austin streets slowly came alive. Cars hummed down the road, neighbors walked their dogs, children's laughter echoed faintly from the playground nearby. Life went on, indifferent to the wars fought at family tables, and as I stood there, bitterness shifted into something sharper. I realized that being the erased one had shaped me in ways they couldn't see. It had forced me to carve out an identity that didn't rely on their approval. It had made me stronger, more self-reliant, more unyielding. When people keep erasing you, I whispered to myself, you learn to write yourself in bold ink. I vowed then and there that this wedding would not be another chapter where I disappeared. I would not sit quietly, scribbled out of existence. Not this time. I rinsed my mug, set it back on the counter, and let the determination settle in my bones. They may pretend I don't exist, I murmured, the words firm. But I'll remind them in ways they can't forget. I told myself I wouldn't go back. After the last dinner, the humiliation still burned in my chest, yet a week later, I found myself driving out to my father's ranch house again. Part of it was duty. Bronwyn had called, gently reminding me, it's Sunday, Kitty. You know Dad expects us there. Another part was defiance. I didn't want them thinking I was hiding, afraid to show my face. I wanted them to see that I could walk into their fire and not flinch. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, the sight of the house made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a stage for rehearsed performances where I was always cast as the disappointment. Families love to wrap their dysfunction in rituals like Sunday dinners. It's supposed to mean warmth, tradition, comfort. For us, it was just another court session, and I was the defendant. Walking inside, I heard laughter from the dining room. The smell of roast chicken filled the air, but my appetite was gone. Chairs scraped as people settled around the table. I took a seat, folding my hands, bracing myself. I knew the table wasn't set for food. It was set for another trial. I remembered something Irma Bombeck once said. Guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. And in this family, they handed it out like dessert. My father didn't waste time. His deep voice cut through the chatter. Everything you are today is because of us, he declared, eyes fixed on me. The room stilled. My heart sank. Here it was. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the table. Your college tuition, your first apartment, those weren't free. We invested in you, Kitty. Now it's your turn. I felt my face flush. My turn, as though being their daughter had been some kind of financial arrangement. Invested? I said, keeping my voice measured. I'm your daughter, not a stock portfolio. His jaw tightened. Don't play word games. You owe this family. Mahola jumped in, her voice sweet as honey but sharp underneath. Sacrifice is what defines family. We all gave something. What makes you think you're exempt? I gripped my napkin in my lap, forcing myself not to shout. I'm not exempt. I've lived on my own for years, paid my bills, managed everything without asking for your help. That's sacrifice too. Ignacia snorted. Barely. You live like a pauper. And for what? Pride? If you really cared, you'd make room in your life to give back. Their words twisted around me, each one reshaping my independence into selfishness. It was a trap. Every path I took led to guilt. Bronwyn stayed silent again, his eyes on his plate, fork tracing slow circles. I saw his fists clench, but the words never came. I thought of all the Americans I'd known, friends whose parents guilt-tripped them with the same script. You owe us. We gave you life. You're indebted forever. It was a story older than any of us, but it didn't sting less hearing it spoken across the table with my name attached. The conversation spun faster, voices piling on. I pushed back finally, sharper than I had before. I don't owe you a cent. Love isn't a loan. Parenthood isn't a business transaction. The table fell into a tense quiet. My father's nostrils flared. He wasn't finished. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing, and then came the blow that knocked the air from the room. You'll regret this when I'm gone, he said, his voice like gravel. When I'm in the ground, you'll wish you had been a real daughter. The words struck harder than any bill or accusation. A chill swept through me. The room froze. Even Ignacia's smile faltered. She looked down at her plate, suddenly uneasy. Mahola blinked, caught off guard by his venom. Inside, my thoughts spun. Threats of death used as chains. Only a parent knows how to wield them. He wasn't just asking for money anymore. He was twisting mortality into a weapon, trying to make me carry a guilt that hadn't even happened yet. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The weight of his words pressed against my chest, but I steadied myself. I would not crumble. I set my fork down deliberately and lifted my head. My voice was calm, deliberate. Don't use your death as a weapon against me, I said. I won't carry a guilt you chose to hand me. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Chairs shifted uncomfortably. No one expected me to speak like that, least of all my father. His face hardened, but he said nothing. I looked around the table, meeting each gaze. For the first time, I felt clarity instead of shame. He had shown me the worst he could give, and I was still standing. I realized I had nothing left to lose. In America, we're taught to honor our parents, to revere them. But honor doesn't mean surrender. It doesn't mean letting yourself be crushed under the weight of manipulations dressed as love. I leaned back in my chair, my tone calm but icy. Keep pushing, I told my father, and you'll see just how much strength your forgotten daughter has. The table went silent again, and I knew then the next battle would not be with words alone. Dinner dragged on after my father's cruel threat, but the air in that dining room grew heavier with every passing moment. The chicken and potatoes sat untouched on my plate, my appetite long gone. It didn't feel like a family meal. It felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been written and the sentence carried out. Every glance, every smirk, every silence pressed against me like a weight I could barely hold. Ignacia leaned into the spotlight, as if waiting for her next turn to speak. She thrived on being the center of attention. Mahola sat back, her expression smug, quietly watching me squirm as though she were enjoying a performance. My father hadn't spoken again, but his presence lingered over the table like an iron gavel. Inside, I repeated to myself, if silence was permission, I was about to revoke it. The moment came when Ignacia tilted her glass of wine and announced, Howard just bought us a new BMW. That's what stability looks like, Kitty. She smiled sweetly, her voice sharpened with venom. I stared at her, the words crawling under my skin. Congratulations, I said, my tone steady but cutting. But stability built on someone else's checkbook isn't stability, it's dependence. The smile vanished from her face. Jealousy doesn't look good on you, she shot back. It's not my fault you chose a life that left you scraping by. I leaned forward. I don't measure life by imported cars or expensive furniture. I measure it by integrity. And that's something you can't buy, no matter how much money Howard throws around. Mahola jumped in, her eyes narrowing on me. It's not envy, Kitty. It's about showing you what real success looks like. Your sister has achieved something you should aspire to. I laughed under my breath, shaking my head. Aspire? If selling out your dignity counts as success, then I'll stay exactly where I am. The room crackled with tension. Ignacia's cheeks flushed red, her fork clinking against her plate as she gripped it tighter. I could feel everyone at the table leaning into the conflict, some pretending to look down at their food, others watching the exchange like spectators at a fight. Just as the silence stretched, a family friend, one of my father's old colleagues who had been invited for the evening, spoke up. His voice was light but cruel. Every family has a black sheep. Guess we found ours tonight. Laughter rippled around the table. Some chuckled uncomfortably, others laughed outright. The sound cut deeper than anything else that had been said. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and for a moment I felt the sting of being branded, singled out as the blemish on their perfect picture. I froze, gripping my wineglass so tightly that it trembled in my hand. The liquid inside rippled, but I didn't spill a drop. Then I steadied myself. I lifted my chin, my voice strong and unwavering. Black sheep or not, I'd rather be the one who walks alone than follow blindly into corruption. The laughter died instantly. Forks stopped mid-air, glasses hung frozen halfway to lips. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, and it belonged to me. I met their eyes one by one. My father's jaw tightened, Ignacia's face burned red, and Mahola muttered something under her breath. The guest who had spoken leaned back, his smirk fading. I took a slow breath, letting the strength of my words settle inside me. For the first time in years, I wasn't shrinking under their judgment. I wasn't hiding or apologizing. If being your black sheep means keeping my dignity, I said deliberately, my voice low but firm, then so be it. I won't apologize for refusing to be your wallet. The shock was visible. My father's hand clenched around his glass, Ignacia's eyes filled with fury, Mahola's lips curled in disapproval. But none of them spoke. Inside, I felt something shift. For the first time, I was standing taller than all of them, even as I sat in that chair. I pushed my chair back slowly, the sound echoing in the dining room like a final verdict. They thought I would stay seated, I told myself. They were wrong. When the invitation came for what my father called a reconciliation dinner, I knew better than to expect anything close to peace. But I went anyway. Part of me wanted to prove that I wasn't afraid, that no amount of humiliation could make me disappear. Still, as I pulled into the parking lot of Stefano's, the high-end Italian restaurant where my parents had celebrated anniversaries long before my mother passed, I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. Inside, the air carried the scent of garlic and wine, mingling with the low hum of conversation from well-dressed diners. The lighting was warm, the kind meant to make everything look softer, kinder, but I wasn't fooled. I followed the hostess through rows of white tablecloths and flickering candles until we reached the long table reserved for us. Ignacia sat at the center, glowing like a bride already performing for her audience, my father and stepmother flanking her like guards. My seat, however, was near the far end, tucked so close to the swinging restroom door that I could feel the draft each time it opened. It wasn't an accident, it was a message. I gave a small, humorless smile. Interesting choice of seat, I murmured, sliding into the chair. Mahola leaned toward me, her painted smile as sharp as glass. Closer to the staff, she said sweetly. Maybe you'll feel more at home. I looked down at the crisp white napkin in my lap, my teeth gritting. They didn't just want me excluded, they wanted me humiliated. Each time a diner brushed past me to the restroom, the back of my chair jolted slightly. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Disposable, inconvenient, shoved to the margins. As the first course was served, Ignacia launched into a monologue about the wedding vendors, imported flowers, crystal chandeliers, custom menus in embossed gold. She gestured with her hands, her voice loud enough to ensure every guest at neighboring tables could overhear. The venue will look like something out of a magazine," she said proudly. "Howard says no expense is too much for me." Her fiancé sat beside her, grinning, basking in the performance. The rest of the table leaned in, nodding, offering polite approval. I sat back, letting her words wash over me like static, waiting for the inevitable turn. It came sooner than I expected. My father set down his wine glass, fixing me with that stern gaze I had known since childhood. "Kitty," he said, his voice carrying down the length of the table, "we've been patient, but if you can't contribute, you don't belong here." I felt every eye land on me. The chatter of the restaurant dimmed. Even the waitstaff seemed to pause mid-step. I straightened, my voice calm though my heart raced. "Family is not a membership I pay dues for." The words had barely left my mouth before my father's hand slammed against the table, silverware rattling. "Then leave," he thundered. "Get out." The room froze. Forks dropped, glasses stilled. Guests at other tables turned to watch, their faces a mix of curiosity and discomfort. My sister's smile faltered. Mahola smirked as if satisfied with the spectacle. Inside me, something cracked. Not with weakness, but with clarity. It wasn't just rejection, it was exile. To be cast out so publicly, by the man who was supposed to protect me, was a wound deeper than any unpaid bill. For a moment I sat perfectly still, the humiliation burning hot across my face. Then I pushed my chair back slowly, the sound deliberate, echoing across the stunned silence. I stood, shoulders straight, refusing to bow. "If leaving is the price of my integrity," I said evenly, my voice carrying across the table, "then I'll gladly pay it." Whispers rippled through the room. Some guests lowered their eyes in shame, others stared at me with something like respect. I caught sight of a woman at a nearby table, nodding faintly, as if she understood. I walked toward the exit, my steps steady. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, not filled with regret, but with fury. "Don't come back!" I didn't turn. My thoughts were sharp, resolved. He thought throwing me out ended the story. He didn't know it was just the beginning. A week after my father threw me out of Stefano's, an invitation arrived for another family gathering. It wasn't lost on me that the timing was deliberate, as if they wanted to prove how quickly they could bury the chaos of that night. The note said it was to clear the air, but I knew better. My family never cleared the air, they polluted it in new ways. Driving out to the ranch house again, I thought about how American families pride themselves on pretending. They avoid open war, but quietly fight in whispers, staged smiles, and half-truths. This wasn't forgiveness, it was strategy. When I stepped inside, the house buzzed with relatives, neighbors, even family friends. The dining room had been expanded with extra chairs, making the space feel like a stage set for another show. Ignacia stood radiant in the center, greeting guests as though she were already the bride of the year. My father moved from guest to guest, shaking hands, presenting his family like trophies. But my gut told me the spotlight wasn't there to honor anyone, it was to corner me again. Peace was never their goal, control was. Dinner began with polite chatter, but my eyes kept landing on Mahola. She sat close to my father, leaning in, her lips brushing his ear. Her voice was low, but the tone cut sharp, and I caught fragments of her words. "She's never cared about this family," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward me. "She'll ruin Ignatia's big day if you let her." My father nodded slowly, his face hardening. He didn't glance my way, but I felt the shift, the cold wall of judgment rising again. The sting of being undermined in whispers cut deeper than if she had shouted across the table. That was the poison of people like Mahola, quiet enough to maintain appearances, deadly enough to plant doubt where it mattered. In families like ours, whispers traveled louder than shouts. I sat rigid, pretending to eat, but inside the betrayal simmered. How many times had she tilted the scales against me with a single murmur? How many times had Dad taken her words as gospel while mine were treated as excuses? Laughter rose around the table as stories were told, but the undercurrent was clear. The stage was being set, and I was already the villain. After dessert, my father stood, tapping his glass for silence. "A toast," he declared. To my children, the pride of my life. The guests clinked their glasses, eyes bright, waiting. He gestured toward Bronwyn. My dependable son, a man anyone could count on. Applause followed, heads nodding. Then he turned to Ignatia, his voice swelling. My perfect daughter, beautiful, responsible, the light of this family. Guests clapped again, some raising their glasses high in agreement. Ignatia blushed, beaming as though she were already on a stage. I waited, holding my breath, eyes fixed on him. I waited for my name, for even a scrap of acknowledgement. It never came. I felt the omission land harder than a slap. The room seemed to tilt, the sound of clinking glasses fading into silence. I whispered under my breath, more to myself than anyone. I waited for my name, but it never came. Some guests glanced my way awkwardly, their eyes flickering with discomfort. Others looked away, complicit in their silence. My sister smirked at her plate, savoring the victory of my erasure. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but cutting. You forgot one. Or was that intentional? The room stilled. My father froze, his glass hovering mid-air. No one answered. The silence screamed louder than words. I let the moment hang before I leaned back, my expression steady. The absence of my name burned louder than any insult they could have spoken. I rose slightly in my chair, addressing the room. If silence is your way of erasing me, I said firmly, I'll write myself back louder than ever. Relatives exchanged uneasy looks. Some squirmed in their seats, others avoided my eyes, but I could see it. The calmness of my tone cut deeper than if I had shouted. Inside, I felt the shift again. The louder they erased me, the more visible I became to myself. Their silence wasn't my end, it was my proof. I set down my napkin, my decision made. I wasn't going to sit through another evening of erasure dressed up as celebration. I stood, pushing my chair back, the sound sharp against the hardwood floor. I'll leave you to your toast, I said coolly, my eyes meeting my father's, then Ignatia's. But don't mistake silence for surrender. I walked out before anyone could respond, the murmurs of relatives trailing behind me. Some looked ashamed, some still complicit, but none brave enough to speak. As I stepped into the cool night air, I thought to myself, they thought whispers and omissions would break me. They forgot silence can scream. The call came on a Tuesday morning. My father's voice was clipped, rehearsed, as though he had already played out the entire conversation in his head. We'll have one more meeting, he said. One last chance to talk this through. You'll be there. I didn't ask if it was optional. It never was. That Friday, I drove back to the ranch house, the road stretching long and unforgiving under the March sky. This time, though, I wasn't walking in empty-handed. I had a folder in my bag, papers that carried weight not in words but in undeniable numbers. They thought I'd keep showing up unarmed. Tonight, I carried my own ammunition. Inside, the dining room had been staged again, more tribunal than family gathering. My father sat at the head, Ignatia at his right hand, her fiancé beaming beside her. Mahola had her notebook open, pen poised, like a secretary recording evidence. Around them were relatives and family friends, called in like witnesses. The entire setup screamed judgment. And I took my seat, breathing slowly, letting my eyes sweep the room. If they wanted a show, I would give them one. Ignatia began before the salads had even been cleared. It's embarrassing, Kitty. Every one of us has stepped up. I don't understand why you can't do your part. Her tone dripped with condescension, as if she were the victim of my refusal. My father's voice followed, heavy with command. We've asked enough times. You need to contribute. This is family. I reached into my bag and drew out the envelope. The sound of the papers sliding onto the table cut sharper than any argument. Receipts, bank transfers, copies of checks I had written over the years, all laid out in plain view. Hospital bills I'd covered for my father after his surgery, a down payment I had given Ignacia when her car was repossessed, smaller loans here and there that had quietly disappeared into their pockets. You keep telling me I don't contribute, I said evenly, my voice steady. Funny, when I look at these numbers, I've given more than any of you. The room fell silent. Eyes widened. A cousin leaned forward, scanning the receipts. The only sound was the faint rustle of paper as I pushed the stack toward my father. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. The sound of proof hitting the table was louder than shouting, heavier than guilt. Guests murmured, their whispers threading through the silence like cracks in the facade. Ignatia's face flushed crimson. This is irrelevant, she stammered. That was then. This is now. No, Ignacia, I said, meeting her glare. This is a pattern. You take, you demand, you pretend it's owed. Well, not anymore. I let the weight of the silence hang. For once, it was mine. But I wasn't finished. This isn't about a wedding, I continued, my voice cutting through the whispers. It's about money. The wedding is just a cover. Ignacia slammed her hand against the table. You're jealous, she shouted, her voice cracking. You've always been jealous. You'll never have what I have. What you have? I leaned forward. A fiancé's wallet? Dad's favoritism? A family willing to bleed everyone else dry so you can play princess? You're not building a marriage. You're bankrolling a lifestyle. The words hung heavy. My father shifted in his chair, his face darkening, but he didn't deny it. His silence betrayed him. Then a voice broke from the corner of the room. An aunt, usually quiet, spoke with hesitation. I overheard, weeks ago, Ignacia and Mahola. They were discussing using the wedding funds for the new business, the salon project. They said it would all roll together. Gasps rippled through the room. Ignacia's fiancé turned sharply, his smile collapsing. What? He demanded, his face paling. Ignacia stuttered, searching for words, but none came. Mahola's pen froze mid-scribble. There it was, the truth exposed, not by me, but by someone they hadn't expected. The entire charade cracked wide open. I rose slowly, my chair scraping back. My eyes swept the room, catching every gaze, letting the weight of the moment anchor me. If being part of this family means being robbed in the name of love, I said clearly, then I'd rather stand alone. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, shame written across their faces. Others avoided my eyes, unwilling to face the truth that had been laid bare. My father stayed silent, and that silence screamed complicity louder than any words he could have spoken. Inside, I felt something I hadn't in weeks: empowerment, the rage, the humiliation, the guilt. It all sharpened into clarity. Truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, leaving them on the table for everyone to see. Let them study the evidence. Let them whisper about the lies. I didn't need to argue anymore. They thought whispers and shame would corner me, I thought as I walked toward the door. Tonight, I cornered them instead. The house felt different the next time I stepped into it. Days had passed since I laid the receipts on the table, proof that I had given more than they ever cared to admit. But instead of clearing the air, my evidence had thickened it. Conversations in the family went quiet when I entered the room. Phone calls that used to come weekly stopped altogether. And still, I could feel it. The plotting, the whispering, the rehearsing of a new angle to corner me. Silence wasn't peace. It was calculation. I walked through the living room, my shoes sinking into the thick rug, past the family portraits that had always told the same story. Ignatia's face front and center, Bronwyn steady at my father's side. My mother's smile frozen in the one photograph they hadn't yet replaced. My image, when it appeared at all, was always blurred at the edges, like I had been fading from their narrative for years. In America, people like to believe that truth sets everything right. But I knew better. In America, when truth finally lands, it doesn't mend families, it exposes the cracks. Gloria Steinem once said, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off." That line rang in my ears. The truth I had dropped on their polished table hadn't freed anyone. It had enraged them because it left no place to hide. That afternoon, I went to the ranch house again, not for dinner this time, but to gather a few belongings of my late mother's that I had asked for months ago. The air inside felt heavier, darker. Ignacia was already there, strutting through the living room in a silk blouse, her fiancé at her side. She greeted me with a smirk that told me this wasn't going to be a simple visit. Then I saw it. Around her neck hung the necklace, my mother's necklace, the delicate gold chain with the small emerald pendant she used to let me play with as a child. the one she had promised would one day be mine. My breath caught in my throat. "That necklace," I said slowly, pointing. "That was Mom's. It was meant for me." Ignatia's smirk widened as she tilted her chin, letting the emerald catch the light. "Dad said I should have it," she replied smoothly. "I'm the one getting married. It belongs to me now." The room tilted. It wasn't just jewelry. It was my mother's memory, her promise, my last connection to her. To see it resting against Ignatia's skin felt like theft far deeper than money. "You didn't just take a necklace," I said, my voice tightening. "You took memory. You took meaning." Her fiancé laughed under his breath. "It suits her better anyway." I turned to my father, who had entered quietly during the exchange, his arms crossed. "You gave it away?" He didn't flinch. "Ignatia will wear it on her wedding day. It's fitting. You don't need trinkets to remember your mother." I swallowed hard, the betrayal slicing deeper than I could show. But the worst was still to come. Later, as relatives gathered in the living room for coffee, my father cleared his throat, signaling he had something to say. The chatter dimmed, eyes turned toward him. "I want everyone to hear this," he said firmly. "Everything I have, my home, my savings, my land, will go to Ignatia. She deserves it more. Kitty has shown she doesn't care about family." The words hit me like a cold wind. Around the room, reactions varied. Some relatives nodded quietly, others shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes. But no one spoke against him. I stood frozen, my heart pounding, erased. Not just overlooked, not just sidelined, erased from my own bloodline. My voice broke through the silence, sharper than I expected. "Family is not something you buy," I said. "It's something you live, and you've sold yours cheap." For a moment, no one breathed. My father's eyes hardened, but he said nothing. Ignacia beamed, victorious, her hand brushing the necklace as if to remind me what else she had claimed. It was a scene many would recognize, the cutting of wills used as punishment, the weaponizing of inheritance to control, to diminish, to crown favorites, and erase the rest. In America, countless children find themselves written out not because they failed, but because they refused to bow. The gathering broke apart in uneasy silence, relatives dispersing in clusters, whispering. I slipped out quietly, my body trembling but my head held high. Driving home, the night sky stretched dark and endless above me. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind replaying every word, every glance, every betrayal, the necklace, the will, the theft not just of money, but of belonging. But as the miles rolled beneath my tires, something shifted. Losing inheritance didn't mean losing myself. They could strip away jewelry, land, even my place in their stories. But they couldn't erase me from me. "Inheritance isn't money or jewelry," I whispered aloud, the sound filling the car. "It's the courage to stand alone when your name is erased." Sadness weighed heavy in my chest, but underneath it pulsed something steadier, quiet strength. And as I turned onto the road toward my apartment, I let the words settle into resolve. If they want war, then I'll bring the kind of truth that leaves no room for lies. When the phone call came, I knew exactly what it meant. My father's voice was controlled, heavy with that tone he used whenever he thought he was being magnanimous. "We'll do another dinner," he said, "to restore dignity." His words dripped with performance. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. I agreed to come, but not because I believed anything had changed. No, this wasn't reconciliation. It was another trap, a stage carefully arranged to remind me of my place, or try to. As I drove to Stefano's again, the memory of being thrown out of that same restaurant weeks earlier sat in my chest like a stone. The restaurant was buzzing when I arrived. Stefano's was known for its polished white tablecloths, its clinking glasses, and its soft piano music drifting through the dining room. But that evening, the air was different. Relatives, family, friends, even acquaintances filled the long table. I could feel their eyes on me the moment I stepped inside. Whispers traveled faster than the waiters carrying trays. I took my seat, noting Ignacia's glow as she occupied the center, her fiancé at her side. Mahola leaned back with smug composure, and my father presided at the head, as if about to deliver another ruling. I sat down, keeping my hands folded in my lap. This time, they wanted an audience, I thought. But an audience can turn against the show. The evening began with stiff politeness, wine glasses lifted, practiced smiles exchanged. The tension, though, threaded through every glance, every pause. It didn't take long for the first strike to land. As the waiter cleared the plates from the main course, he returned with the leather folder that held the check. His eyes flickered, uncertain, before he placed it directly in front of me. The room erupted in laughter. Ignatia leaned back, smirking. "Even strangers know who should pay," Mahola added smoothly. "Maybe this is fate reminding you, Kitty." Nervous chuckles spread down the table. Some guests laughed too loudly, others glanced down at their plates, uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt the spectacle. My face burned, but I didn't let my expression falter. Inside, my thoughts hardened. They thought humiliation in public would break me. But shame only destroys you if you accept it. I slowly pushed the folder back across the table toward my father. "Looks like it landed in the wrong place," I said calmly, my tone steady enough to cut through the laughter. The silence that followed was sharp. Ignacia's smirk faltered for a moment, but my father's glare only deepened. The tension simmered, ready to spill over. Then, unexpectedly, a voice rose from the far end of the table. "Enough!" It was one of my father's old friends, a man who had known our family for decades. His voice was steady, his eyes fixed on the head of the table. "This isn't family, it's extortion dressed as tradition." The laughter died immediately. Forks stilled. Glasses stopped midair. The room froze. For the first time in years, I felt a surge in my chest, not fear, but the startling rush of being defended, of being seen. My heart pounded, not from humiliation this time, but from vindication. My father opened his mouth, but no words came. Ignatia's cheeks flushed crimson, her fiancé looked uneasy, and Mahola's pen, always scribbling notes as though she were keeping score, slid forgotten onto the tablecloth. The symbolism struck me. One voice had shattered the mob mentality. It only took one person willing to step into the silence to break their spell. I rose slowly, steadying myself on the back of my chair. "If this is how you define family," I said, my voice strong, "then I'll choose dignity over blood." Gasps rippled across the table. Some guests looked shocked, others lowered their eyes in shame. A few nodded faintly, silently agreeing. For the first time, I wasn't drowned by their voices. Mine drowned them. I let my gaze sweep across each face. My father's hardened expression, Ignacia's reddened fury, Mahola's icy stare, but none of them could undo what had just happened. The balance had shifted, and we all knew it. I gathered my bag, stood tall, and walked toward the door. Behind me, the murmurs of the crowd swelled like a wave, no longer mocking but unsettled. Judgment turned inward. They wanted to shame me in public. Instead, they were the ones exposed. The drive back to my father's ranch house felt like walking willingly into a storm. After the spectacle at Stefano's, I knew there was no reconciliation waiting for me. Still, something in me needed to face him directly. One final time. The gravel crunched beneath my tires as I pulled into the driveway. The house looked the same as always, brick walls, wide porch, the chimes tinkling in the wind, but it carried a different chill. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, but the story they told was painfully clear. Ignatia's face dominated every frame: graduation, birthday parties, vacations. Bronwyn stood solid in a few, steady as ever, his arm around Dad. My mother's smile lived only in one fading portrait. And me? I was barely visible, caught at the edges, a blurred figure fading from their history. Sometimes homes become museums of favoritism, not love. I walked down the hall toward his study. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep my pace even. I wasn't here to beg. I wasn't here to negotiate. I was here to hear the final truth spoken aloud. He didn't make me wait. Abdulia sat behind his desk, arms crossed, eyes hard. The moment I stepped inside, he said coldly, "Don't come back if you can't act like family. You're no daughter of mine." The words landed like a gavel, final and cruel. My breath caught, my throat closing. The silence that followed pressed in, heavy, suffocating. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause between ticks. I steadied myself, letting the sting wash through me. "Blood made me your daughter," I said, my voice shaking at first, but growing stronger with each word. "Love should have kept me there. You chose otherwise." It felt as though he had taken scissors to our bond, severing it in one brutal stroke. For many, money cuts deepest. But for me, this, his denial, his disownment, was the wound that would scar longest. He leaned back, unmoved, his silence deliberate. I stood straighter. I refused to let him see me collapse. "You can erase me from your will, from your words, from your dinner table," I said firmly. "But you can't erase me from myself." My father's eyes narrowed, but he didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence screamed all on its own. I turned toward the door. As I walked out, I passed Ignacia in the hallway. For the first time, she didn't meet my gaze. Her eyes dropped, her shoulders shifted uneasily, as though even she knew the cruelty had gone too far. Disownment wasn't my end. It was my release. I stepped outside into the cold night air, the chill wrapping around me, sharp but clean. My body trembled, but it wasn't weakness. It was the trembling of release, of finally being free from chains I hadn't chosen. Driving away, the headlights cut through the darkness. My mind replayed everything. The necklace given away, the inheritance erased, my father's words cutting me loose. But as grief pressed down, something steadier rose beneath it. I remembered a line I had once read. "Sometimes you have to give up on people, not because you don't care, but because they don't." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I let them fall. Not from despair, but from acceptance. I would never be the daughter they wanted, but I could be the woman I chose to be. By the time I reached the city lights of Austin, sorrow had begun to shift into clarity. I whispered aloud, letting the words steady me. They thought disowning me ended the story, but all it did was free me to write my own. I knew they would try one more time. Families like mine never end quietly. After the last eruption at Stefano's, the whispers spread through town like wildfire. Neighbors stopped me in the grocery store, eyes curious, voices lowered. "Are you all right, Kitty?" they asked, as if waiting for me to crack. Then the phone call came, not from my father, not from Ignacia, but from a distant cousin, telling me there would be a community event at the center, a chance to put things right. I almost laughed. They didn't want to put things right. They wanted to show the world I was finished. When I arrived, the room buzzed with the sound of chairs scraping, coffee cups clinking, and the hum of hushed voices. Relatives, neighbors, and acquaintances filled the seats. I felt the weight of their stares as I walked in, each one a witness to my trial. They wanted to show the world I was alone. What they didn't know was that the world was already watching them. The tension crackled as I sat. Whispers rippled like smoke through the room, stories of Stefano's, the inheritance, the necklace, my so-called defiance. Every eye seemed to ask, would I bow this time? I thought of George Herbert's words, "Living well is the best revenge." Tonight, I wasn't there to win them back. I was there to end the game. It didn't take long for the trap to spring. My father rose, his voice booming across the hall. "You've disrespected your family for the last time. From this day forward, you are no daughter of mine." The words were deliberate, loud, crafted for the audience. He wanted witnesses for my erasure. Ignacia, dressed as though for a rehearsal dinner, leaned back in her chair, the heirloom necklace catching the light. She smirked, her eyes daring me to fight. Mahola leaned close to a neighbor, whispering just loud enough to be heard. She brought this on herself. Always selfish, always against us. The poison spread quickly, a chorus of nods and murmurs. My chest tightened. They wanted me isolated. They wanted me erased, one last time, in public. But before I could answer, a chair scraped against the floor. Bronwyn stood. My brother, silent for so long, hesitant at every dinner, always lowering his gaze, finally raised his voice. "If this is what family looks like," he said, his voice cutting across the hall, "then Kitty is better without it. and I won't sit here in silence anymore." The room gasped. Conversations died mid-sentence. My father froze, shock breaking through his composure. Ignatia's smirk collapsed, and Mahola's pen slipped from her hand. The power dynamic shifted instantly. One ally, one voice, was enough to unravel the spectacle. My heart pounded, but not from humiliation this time, from strength, from the unexpected surge of being defended. They wanted me to leave in shame. Instead, I left with company, and with dignity. Bronwyn walked to my side, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. For once, his silence was broken by action, and that action carried more weight than all their accusations combined. I rose beside him, turning to the room. "They thought exile was punishment," I said, my voice clear. "They forgot freedom is the greatest gift." We walked together toward the exit. Behind us, relatives murmured, some ashamed, some still angry, but none with the certainty they had walked in with. The necklace still glimmered against Ignatia's skin, but it looked smaller now, gaudy in its theft. My father stood rigid, but his power cracked, the silence no longer working in his favor. Outside, the cool evening wrapped around us. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift. For the first time, I didn't feel erased. I felt reborn. I looked at Bronwyn. He nodded, no words needed. Together, we stepped into the night. I turned one last thought over in my mind, a final word not for them, but for myself. I didn't win by shouting louder. I won by standing taller. My family disowned me, but I found a truer family in those who walked beside me, and that, more than any inheritance, was the legacy I chose.